12:15 in the morning, an entire American city began playing music for a murderer. Not because they were celebrating, because they were afraid he was listening. New Orleans, 1919. The streets were still warm after sunset. Gas lamps burned above narrow sidewalks. Families locked their doors, checked their windows, and tried not to look too long at the dark spaces between houses. For months, someone had been entering homes at night, not always by force. Sometimes he used a chisel to break through a door. Sometimes he found the weapon inside the house. An axe, a hatchet, a blade that belonged to the people sleeping under that roof. That detail mattered because it made the attacks feel personal. The killer did not need to bring death with him. He borrowed it from the home. The newspapers called him the Axeman. His victims were often Italian and Sicilian immigrant families, many of them grocers who lived above or beside their small corner stores. They were not famous people. They had no powerful names behind them. They were working families in a city that already looked at them as outsiders. New Orleans had a long memory for suspicion. To many people, Italian names came with old rumors. Sicilian accents were treated like secrets. A small grocery could become, in the public imagination, something darker than a store. So when the attacks began, fear did not fall evenly across the city. It gathered around one community first. Men sat awake near their doors. Women listened for movement under the floorboards. Children learned that a locked room was not the same thing as a safe room. The Axeman did not attack in the street. He entered rooms that still held the shape of ordinary life. A kettle left warm on the stove. A blanket half folded beside a sleeping child. A lamp blown out only minutes before. That was where he came, where people were not performing courage, where no one expected to be seen. In one attack, a husband and wife were found butchered in their own home. In another, a child did not survive. In another, a woman woke up into a nightmare that had already entered the room. The city did what cities do when they are scared. It made theories. Some people blamed criminal gangs. Some reached for old words like vendetta, mafia, and black hand. Others whispered that the killer was only a madman moving through the dark. But none of those answers stayed still for long. A burglar steals. A rival warns you before he strikes. A gang leaves a message that can be understood. This person entered sleeping homes, attacked families in the dark, and left behind almost nothing but blood and confusion. By the spring of 1919, New Orleans was not just afraid of a man. It was afraid of a rule no one understood. A door could be locked. A window could be checked. A father could sit awake with a gun in his lap. And still, somewhere after midnight, something might already be inside. Then, on March 16th, the newspaper printed a letter. It was addressed to the editor of the Times-Picayune. The writer claimed to be the Axeman, but he did not describe himself as a criminal. He did not even describe himself as human. He called himself a spirit, a demon, a thing from the hottest hell. And then he made a promise. On the next Tuesday night, at 12:15 earthly time, he said he would pass over New Orleans. He would choose his victims, but there was one way to survive. Play jazz. Not pray, not hide, not call the police. Play jazz. That is where the story stops being only true crime. That is where it becomes something older. Because for one night, New Orleans was not a city hunting a killer. It was a city preparing an offering. letter was theatrical, almost too theatrical. It mocked the police. It boasted that no one had caught him. It said the writer was invisible, like ether around the earth. It said he was not a human being, but a spirit and a demon. Then came the condition. Any house with a jazz band in full swing would be spared. Think about what that meant. A murderer had turned music into a protection spell. A trumpet became a lock. A piano became a prayer. A dance band became a circle of salt around the bed. No priest declared it. No church blessed it. No law ordered it. But fear does not wait for permission. By the night of the threat, people across New Orleans had begun to prepare. Some hired bands. Some went to crowded cafes. Some gathered in dance halls, not because they wanted to dance, but because being alone felt like offering yourself to the dark. Homes that might have been quiet after midnight stayed awake. Children heard music through walls. Neighbors listened for the sound of a trumpet from next door. Some people laughed too loudly because they did not want anyone to hear how scared they were. Others sat beside their instruments with their eyes fixed on the door. Let me show you what that night may have felt like. A family sits inside a small room above a grocery. The store below them smells faintly of flour, onions, dust, and wooden crates. The father has pushed a chair against the back door, then a second chair, then a table. He knows it will not stop an axe, but his hands need something to do. The mother keeps the children away from the windows. One child keeps asking why they cannot sleep. No one answers. At the piano, an older cousin plays the same melody again and again. He is not very good. His left hand keeps falling behind. His right hand rushes ahead. The music sounds nervous because the person playing it is nervous. But no one tells him to stop, because a wrong note is still a note, and silence feels dangerous. Across the city, the same fear takes different shapes. In one house, a violin shakes through a song it barely remembers. In another, a trumpet cracks on a high note and everyone in the room flinches. Somewhere, a man checks his pocket watch, then checks it again. 11:58, midnight, 12:03. Outside, the city is not quiet. That is the unnatural part. New Orleans knows music. New Orleans knows late nights. But this was not celebration. This was not pleasure. This was sound used as a barricade. Fear jazz, survival jazz. Music played by people who were not sure whether they were entertaining a killer or warding off a demon. Then the hour came closer. 12:10, 12:11. In one room, a child starts crying. The mother pulls him close, not to comfort him, but to muffle the sound. The father looks toward the ceiling, as if footsteps might come from above instead of outside. 12:12. The piano keeps going, too fast now. The player has stopped reading the music. He is only moving his fingers. 12:13. A dog barks somewhere down the street, then another, then nothing. There was no silence, only the space between songs, filled quickly before it could open too wide. 12:14. Someone whispers that maybe this is foolish. No one answers, because if it is foolish, then they are afraid for nothing. And if it is not foolish, then 1 minute remains. 12:15. For one breath, every room in New Orleans belonged to the same fear, and the city played. Bars were crowded deep into the night, their doors glowing against the dark streets as music spilled onto the sidewalks. Cafes stayed open, dance halls filled. In private homes, people kept their bands going because stopping felt like leaving a window unlocked. Every street must have sounded different. A trumpet from one house, a piano from another, laughter from a saloon, a nervous violin behind a shuttered window. The whole city became an altar of noise. Not everyone believed the letter, but belief was not required, only obedience. That is the most disturbing part. Not the acts, not even the letter, the obedience. One anonymous message entered the city through the newspaper, and thousands of people changed their behavior. They rearranged their homes. They paid musicians. They stayed awake. They turned fear into sound. That is how powerful the Axeman had become. He did not have to enter every house. He entered the imagination of the city. And once he was there, every locked door became uncertain. Every quiet room became suspicious. Every shadow near a window became a possible witness. By morning, one fact made the legend worse. The Axeman did not strike that night. No attack was reported. No family was found in blood. No axe was left behind. The music had played. The demon had passed. And everyone survived. That should have made New Orleans feel safe. It did not. Because when a ritual appears to work, people do not stop believing in the ritual. They start wondering what would have happened if they had not performed it. Most versions of the Axeman story end with the jazz night. But the part that stays with you is not that people played music. It is that no one could prove what the music had done. There are two stories here. The first is a historical crime story. A killer attacked families in and around New Orleans. Many victims were Italian and Sicilian grocers. The police struggled. Newspapers speculated. Innocent people were blamed. Fear spread faster than evidence. That story is real enough, brutal enough. But the second story is stranger. It is the story of a city that accepted, for one night, that sound could protect the living from something inhuman. This is where the Axeman becomes more than a murderer. He becomes a mask. In folklore, evil often announces itself with a rule. Do not look behind you. Do not answer after midnight. Do not open the door when it calls your name. The Axeman's rule was different. Play jazz, and I will pass you by. That sounds modern, but underneath, it is ancient. It resembles the oldest kind of bargain humans make with fear. Give the darkness something it wants, and maybe it will leave your house untouched. That is why the letter feels almost spiritual. Not holy, spiritual in the darker sense. It created a ritual with a time, a condition, and a promised mercy. The hour was 12:15. The offering was jazz. The reward was survival. And the city obeyed. But there is another layer most retellings move past too quickly. The Axeman did not terrorize the city in a vacuum. He moved through a New Orleans already shaped by suspicion. Italian and Sicilian immigrants had built lives there, opened groceries, raised children, and worked their way into neighborhoods that did not always welcome them. To outsiders, their stores could look like gathering places. Their language could sound like secrecy. Their family networks could be mistaken for conspiracy. So when Italian grocers were attacked, many people reached for the story they already knew. They called it criminal revenge. They called it foreign violence. They made it sound like something that belonged to the victim's own world, not to the city around them. That is one of the ugliest parts of the case. A community was being hunted, and at the same time, that community was being suspected. The victims were not only afraid of the Axeman, they had to fear being misunderstood by the police, the press, and their neighbors. To be an outsider in a panic is to be endangered twice. First by the person who comes through the door, then by the people who decide what your suffering means. That is why the jazz letter spread so powerfully. For one night, a fear that had gathered first around immigrant groceries moved outward until the entire city obeyed the same rule. If you are quiet, you are vulnerable. If you play, you may live. But there is another possibility. The letter may not have been written by the killer at all. Some historians have questioned whether the real Axeman wrote such a theatrical, educated, almost literary message. The writer knew how to create suspense. He knew how to use the newspaper. He knew how to turn terror into performance. If that is true, the horror changes shape. Because then, New Orleans may not have been controlled by the murderer that night. It may have been controlled by someone wearing his name. That might be even worse. A killer with an axe can enter one house at a time, but a story can enter every house at once. It can sit at the dinner table. It can stand beside the bed. It can make a grown man check the lock 3 times. It can make a mother tell her child not to stop playing. It can turn a song into a shield. It can make silence feel like a sin. And this is the real nightmare of the Axeman. He did not just murder people. He changed the meaning of quiet. Before him, silence was ordinary. After him, silence became exposure. A quiet house was not peaceful. A quiet house was unprotected. A quiet house was the one he might choose. So when people say the Axeman loved jazz, that may be the wrong way to hear the story. Maybe he did not love jazz at all. Maybe he loved control. Maybe he loved the idea of a city performing for him. Maybe the music was never the point. Maybe the point was to prove that fear could conduct an orchestra. The Axeman was never caught. The identity behind the attacks remains unresolved. The identity behind the letter remains uncertain. And the city moved on, as cities always do. The bars reopened for ordinary nights. The families slept again. The newspapers found new headlines. Jazz returned to being music. Mostly. But somewhere in that story, something still refuses to rest. Because for one night in New Orleans, people did not play music for pleasure. They played because a voice from hell told them to. They played because the police could not save them. They played because a locked door was not enough. And when morning came, no one was dead. So the question is not whether jazz saved New Orleans. The question is worse.